works with federal agencies who, in my experience, in both Joplin and Greensburg in particular, were critically important in the rebuild. And there's always the question that comes from communities that have been disasters: what is the role the federal government plays? And how do we best work with these agencies? And again, Greensburg was a model in the case of both FEMA and the Department of Energy, NREL. Working with them was very important to our success. So our first guest, Mary Werner, is the Executive Manager of Integrated Deployment Projects at NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is a program of the Department of Energy. Mary has been very gracious to join us today. Our original Lynn Billman, who managed the Greensburg program for NREL under Mary, was unable to make it, and Mary came at the last minute. Really appreciate you being here. Mary, if you come up. Give a hand to Mary.
Well, I hope you're enjoying your lunch, and feel free to look up once in a while and keep eating along, and I'll try to make this as interesting as I can and as quick as I can. Thank you for having us here for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, also known as NREL, in Golden, Colorado. We really appreciate being here and being at the Sustainable Disaster Recovery Conference. We think that this is a very important area, and we look at it, of course, from the energy standpoint. So I'm going to be speaking from the standpoint of energy sustainability, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. As Daniel mentioned, I'm filling in for Lynn Billman, so she submitted the slides before we found out she wouldn't be coming, so you'll see her name on the slides. Pretend it says mine. And I'm happy to speak with anyone after the slide. So many people here know about Greensburg, know this kind of information, and could speak to more details about Greensburg than I ever could. So I'm not going to pretend to know the town better than the folks here that live there and know it very well. But I think that we all have this information kind of in the back of our minds already about Greensburg. May 4th, Greensburg it's going about its normal business when the storm hit. And a day later, I think as someone said this morning, I think it was Daniel, that a day later and your world can be turned upside down. So a few days actually after the tornado hit, there was a phone call to the Department of Energy, and they were asked to support the rebuilding efforts. And the Department of Energy called us, and we're the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We are DOE's national lab that focuses on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And so we were asked to come and help, along with many other partners. As you can see here, there were many helping hands in Greensburg, and I'm sure many of you already know that. We had several different federal agencies, a few of which you'll hear about today and tomorrow, and also many other organizations that supported the effort. From the NREL standpoint, we've been around for 35 years as a national lab of the Department of Energy, and our job is to do research and development and deployment of energy efficiency, renewable energy technologies. And so this project, Greensburg, and several other disaster recovery efforts that we've done fall into that category of deploying the technologies that are developed and implemented in the energy efficiency and renewable energy space. So our work scope in Greensburg was along these 5 categories. In the first area, we assisted with the community planning in terms of helping with the energy component into those plans. Several of you are familiar and involved with the development of those plans, whether it's the immediate planning done by FEMA or if it's long-term planning done by the community. We try to help incorporate the energy aspect of that. We also help with buildings in terms of reducing building energy use and supporting that with high-performance homes as well as high-performance commercial buildings. And then using renewable energy, whether it's distributed renewable energy at a building or within the community, or if it's utility scale, which means that it's a bigger project, a bigger amount of generation, and that's going straight into the grid versus serving a local load like a building. Also reducing gasoline and diesel use through transportation alternatives, whether it's more efficient vehicles or whether it's alternative vehicles or whether it's electric vehicles. We support all of those different areas. And then also telling the story after the fact, getting information out on the results, on the activities, so that we can hopefully replicate and continue the great work that's being done. You all have seen this, the community master plan that was developed by BNIM. So I'll skip quickly and go into the residential buildings area. This is a few bullets about what we did in terms of trying to help the homeowners and the builders understand how to improve their energy efficiency. And we have a tool called BOPT, which is a building energy optimization tool that you can use to identify what we call tech specs or tech packages. And it's the technical specifications to achieve a certain efficiency level. And so we did that for Greensburg, and we came up with a couple of different packages. And one was a 30% better than code package, and another was 50% better than code package. And then we had the technical specifications of that, and then we also had the economics. And the bottom left-hand corner of this slide is the economics example, where doing energy efficiency does cost more upfront. But when you look at the life of the building and you look at a 20 or 30-year life, it actually pays for itself and then some. So even at a 7% interest rate, which is what we used for Greensburg 5 years ago, I don't think you'd be seeing 7% these days, but 5 years ago it was around 7% as an average mortgage interest rate. And if you bundle that first cost into the mortgage at the time that you're building the home and purchasing the home, you actually would see money back every year from your utility bills. And that's what we're trying to support in these projects, is incorporating that at the beginning so that you can build it into your mortgage and save money over every year. In terms of the results in the residential area, we were lucky enough to have actual ratings of over 100 different homes in Greensburg through the home energy rating system. And in those over 100 homes that we rated and verified, there was an average of 43% energy cost savings, and that's over what the typical building codes are for that community. Those are some very impressive results. Energy Star for homes, for example, is at 15% better than code. So this far exceeds any Energy Star levels for homes. On the renovation side, we saw an average of 25% better energy efficiency use. And then we also supported a couple of different fairly large projects with the Mennonite housing and also the townhomes that pursued LEED certification. And those are looking at 50% energy cost savings. On the commercial building side, you've already heard a few comments about all the LEED Platinum buildings and LEED certified buildings. And this is just looking at one typical building. It happens to be the Best Western. And having sat in the back of the room earlier today, I know you guys can't read the writing on the right side, so I'll explain the legend for you. It says the Best Western plus Watchman Inn and Suites, utility supplied energy. That's the blue bar. So the typical building, that first long blue bar, is a typical commercial building of this size, of this type. And then the next blue bar is an Energy Star 75 building. And Energy Star 75 means that you are you're better than 75% of the buildings in that classification. So it means you're in the top 25% of buildings. And then the bottom bar, that small blue piece, is what their actual utility energy usage is today. And the little piece next to it before the next little line, if you can see that, that's on-site renewables. They have a wind turbine at the Best Western, So that's on-site renewables provided, and the rest of that bar going all the way out to where the typical building ended is energy efficiency savings from designing the building right the first time. This is an eye chart for you. This is taking that same information across all 13 buildings. And the message here is that consistently we saw very high energy efficiency levels in these buildings. And this is actual. This isn't estimated. This isn't projected. This isn't designed to meet this certain level. This is actual. So this is a proof in the pudding, so to speak, example of where these buildings are taking place. The gray bars are the typical building. The yellow bars are Energy Star 275, and then the blue bars, the short bars, are the actual. Greensburg also was an innovator in LED streetlights, and they are the first community in the US to have almost all LED streetlights. They're 40% more efficient, and they save a tremendous amount in operating and maintenance costs due to the long life of the LED lights. I think probably everyone knows it's very windy in western Kansas, and we decided, and the community decided to take advantage of that wind. I did want to point out one thing here. This is the resource map. Do I have a pointer? No. The left-hand side is a resource map of the United States, and you can see in Kansas on the kind of pink western side, pink is a very high level in the legend. If you look in the legend, it's the second to the highest, and second to the best in terms of the highest class wind that there is in the United States. And on the right-hand side is a graph that's showing wind speed in terms of class of wind, all the way from class wind of 1 all the way up to 23, which is miles per second, and number of hours is the y-axis going up. The impressive part of this is that there are only under 200, maybe 300 hours total out of the entire year where the wind is not blowing at least 5 miles per second. That is an amazing wind resource. I mean, you put Chicago to shame calling themselves the Windy City. I mean, this is far windier and sustained wind. I mean, this is what we love to see from a resource availability standpoint. You can see places with huge peaks in terms of wind speeds, but if it's not sustained and not fairly balanced, it's very difficult to manage from an electricity generation standpoint. This is very nice to see from a wind profile standpoint. And using distributed renewable energy, there were several locations that either did ground source heat pumps, photovoltaics, or wind turbines. And there's several examples of each of those in some of these pictures, as well as probably some of the folks in this room and that you're going to hear from today and tomorrow. And then the last component is the policy element. And this is trying to make the change last. So institutionalizing, I know sometimes we have a bad connotation with that word, but in this case, it's a positive thing. So establishing change for the long term and putting those policies in place that enable the next year and the next year and the next year to be able to build in that progression of energy efficiency, renewable energy. These are policies related to renewable energy in terms of net metering, interconnection standards, wind ordinances, things of that nature, and then also on the efficiency side. And Greensburg decided not to adopt a higher efficiency building code as a requirement, but they did establish a voluntary green building program. So that was their option in terms of making it a requirement. They made it a voluntary program of which many people participated. Taking this to the next step, getting the information out to others so that these examples in these projects can hopefully be replicated with others. And I did want to mention, I brought several examples of these different documents with me. They're at the Greensburg GreenTown exhibit table. They're in a folder, and there are a dozen or so different documents in here. They're from 2 disaster recovery projects that we've done. Some are from Greensburg and the others are from New Orleans. And we also spent 2 years in New Orleans doing very similar work to what we did in Greensburg. And we also have a flyer that looks like this that's sitting there as well. And this captures a little bit of information about what we've done, and also talks about 2 other projects we're working on in the American Samoa and in Haiti. Both of those locations have also had tremendous disasters in the last few years and are doing a lot of recovery and rebuilding. And I just want to also mention that we have a delegation from Japan coming next week, and they're spending 2 days at NREL and then traveling to Greensburg and spending 2 days there. And that's of their interest in trying to help their disaster rebuilding in Japan. And following that, I will be traveling to Japan in December to do follow-up and visit their communities as well. And with that, I think that's it. There are many additional resources on our website. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve. I'm with the federal government. I'm here to help. Kind of works everywhere, doesn't it? Actually, you might have seen me scribbling up here. I had to rewrite everything this morning because all my thunder's been stolen with all the presentations so far, so I'm not really sure if I have much to talk about, but I'll do my best to either be redundant or fill in some gaps. So therefore, I am going to try to help you make up a lot of time this afternoon. Today, I just want to talk about that their sustainability is supported by the federal government in general, and I actually have a little bit of proof to that coming up a little bit later. We're going to talk about some of the mechanics that are used from FEMA to help support sustainability, some of the lessons that we had. I don't want to try to be too redundant with what we've already heard, but maybe a little different presentation. And then a real quick look at some of the next steps that are coming up. Now, we've all heard about what disaster means. I came from a city management and economic and community development background, and I remember asking more than one city council, can I have a bulldozer? A tornado or a flood can be that bulldozer for some communities. If you get past the loss that goes along with disasters, there are some opportunities through that adversity, and how you take advantage of them is very important. We've also talked about optimizing all the resources. Optimizing is there very purposely. This is a two-way street. This makes sure that the federal agencies, state agencies that are the partners as well, are using the money that's best application of taxpayer resources, but also being the best benefit for the local community as well. I was talking to Steve Hewitt a little bit earlier before he had to take off, and he was talking about, yeah, we did get a lot of opportunities in Greensburg. We brought there were a lot of new players and brought money to the table. But if a community isn't positioned to manage and apply those resources, you aren't going to be able to take best advantage of them. And that's very important to be able to work together and do that. Some of the technical assistance that FEMA provides. Now, I'm up here talking from the long-term community recovery branch. I'm not talking all things FEMA at this point. I don't know anything about floodplain maps or some of the housing programs, so I'm just going to stay in my little long-term community recovery area. These are some of the things that we have in place to help with technical assistance. There isn't one textbook on how to do this, and everybody's talked about that. There isn't, but there are a lot of different resources you can go to. One of the reasons there isn't a textbook, because if we tried to cover all the situations, that textbook would be so big that nobody would ever read it and be useless anyway. Mary was even mentioning earlier, I said, for children, there's no one set guide for parenting, because every child, every situation, every parent, they're all different. It's one thing we've really learned with dealing with different disasters all the time is everything is different. Jonathan remembers some of the times when I was talking in Joplin, I would be asked, okay, so what do we do next? I said, well, you know, we can give you some suggestions, and we can give you some best practices, and we can give you examples on before, but guess what? When it comes to Joplin tornado recovery from 2011, even though I've been all around the country and worked on a lot of different disasters and a lot of different community, I have the exact amount of experience for recovery in Joplin as everybody else in that town does. Every situation is different. Some of the things that we bring to the table is we have what's called a self-help guide. It's a 12-step process. It's in a disaster environment to bring communities together, use those stakeholder engagement. It's not brain surgery. It is general planning principles applied in a disaster environment to move things along very quickly. When we were talking in Greensburg, one of the mayors at one time we were first talking about this program said, "Oh yeah, this sounds great, it's really good. Okay, we need this done in 3 weeks." That's a little tough to do with all those things to get done and get ownership in 3 weeks. We're going to talk a little bit about ownership a little bit later. Some of the other things is we have a recovery toolbox. Very quickly, it's just talking about communication. I think we've heard that as kind of one of the top 3 things. After a disaster, sometimes you have good communication before disaster, but sometimes it makes a lot of sense to look back who your audience is, what type of methodology you're using to access them, and who's accountable for doing that, and who's accountable for listening. Communication isn't just telling people, it's also listening. It has to be a two-way street. And if you go through an exercise to identify that and apply accountability, it can be very important in the long run for the community. The National Disaster Recovery Framework, I'm going to cover that in the next disaster. That's part of our next step process on what the federal government is trying to do to add value to the disaster in a comprehensive manner. There's also a mitigation framework, and yes, federal government thinks mitigation is part of sustainability because, as we heard earlier from Valmeyer, do you think it's sustainable to build your community in a floodplain? No, there's a lot of different mitigation methodologies can be applied in a sustainability environment to make it a very holistic approach. MOU with EPA. I'm going to actually have a lot of acronyms in this presentation here, and I will probably use them quite a bit. So somebody step up and say, I don't know what that is, and let me explain what it is. But I'm going to go ahead and use them because as a federal employee, we try to use the best use of your taxpayers' dollars. And by acronyms, I can speed up all the process and get things done a lot quickly. So that's my way of being responsible with your taxpayers' dollars by using acronyms. Anyway, the Memorandum of Understanding actually started in Greensburg. We have a national agreement between 2 federal agencies that started in Greensburg. Way to go, guys. It doesn't happen a whole lot too often. And it actually revolves around sustainability and smart growth. EPA had a program that we didn't actually know about it. In fact, the person that came out from EPA at first, they didn't even know about it. We built on the relationship we had in Greensburg by applying those principles in the next disaster, and eventually it led to a national memorandum of understanding so that we know in a disaster time that we can reach out to them and they can reach to us, and we know how to share money, mostly with them, but we know how to bring those resources to the table in a very integrated manner. I'm not going to bore you with too much bureaucracy at this point, but this is a very important document and it's actually fairly new. How many people have heard of the National Disaster Recovery Framework? Wow, actually a lot more than what I would have anticipated. All right, one of you want to step up here and talk, well, maybe not, okay. The most important thing is, and here's my proof that sustainability is important to the federal government. This NDRF is just a way for, we've talked about everybody working together and communicating. Well, guess what? We're setting up a system and a process for federal agencies to involve state agencies, nonprofits, local governments, private sector, non-government organizations. We're setting up this system so that we can all come together, communicate, and work together. It's a few hundred pages of doctrine and policy and bureaucracy, but the bottom line, we are committed to working together and doing something important that adds value for communities impacted by disaster. And if you go down to bottom bullet, it says resilience and sustainability. That is a core concept that is written in this document. That tells you that these concepts and principles are important to the federal family, and we're going to apply them going forward. Not that we haven't applied them in the back, but this means that we're going to apply them in a very integrated, progressive manner. Here's a quick little recovery process. I'm not sure how much you can see at this point, but it starts to your left and my right. Normal community progress, then you have the jagged lines where all the disaster is. Then we start talking about assessment, which is basically just understanding the impacts. It's actually really hard to do sometimes to understand what are the true impacts. We know how many buildings were damaged, but what does it really mean to our community long term? Then looking at vision, goals, and then finally implementation. Where's the first place everybody goes to? They go to the very end of the arrow. Let's solve that problem and fix it today. Forget that vision, forget that working together, forget those goals, what we're working for. Just go and solve the problem. Build back that city hall. Think if Greensburg had just gone straight to the end and solved that problem for today, they would have the type of city hall they have for tomorrow? Probably not. We held a function, I guess, and where after the tornadoes in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Missouri in 2011, a lot of the folks came to Greensburg to actually experience it. And actually, that's one message I give folks. I mean, we've heard a lot about Greensburg just because they've been a leader on things, but you have to go to Greensburg. You can see pictures, you can hear stories, but until you walk the streets and touch and feel and see this community in person, it really is powerful. And there happens to be a little bed and breakfast that you might be able to stay at too while you're there. Anyway, these folks came in from the other communities and they talked to anybody and everybody in Greensburg. And one thing that I kept hearing over and over again from folks that had experienced a couple years earlier in Greensburg was, slow down. Slow down. Take your time, apply those principles. How long did it take to build a house without a disaster? 3 months, maybe 4 months, depending if your contractor tries to sneak something in or not. Do you think it's going to take 3 weeks to rebuild your house after a disaster? It's not going to happen. A lot of the urgencies that are present in a disaster are sometimes misleading. Sometimes there are a lot of urgencies. Steve Hewitt talked about earlier about all those services. He's got to balance a whole lot of different things. Individuals do as well. They're trying to balance all those things. But sometimes there's a perceived urgency that isn't necessarily there. Another little graphic for us to try to help communicate ebb and flows of disaster recovery. I don't think you can read everything from back there, but the first hump is the response activities. The second one is the intermediate. And then that lower one, but that's a lot broader, is the long term. Joplin right now probably is programming, Jonathan, what do you say, 75 to 85 million dollars in projects that are going to be online in the next 2 to 5 years? Greensburg had to program maybe 35 to 50 million dollars worth of projects that are going along. That is a lot of work to do. Not just planning, but administration, compliance, all those issues. That is really, really hard to do. But you have to be planning for that. You don't have to be, we've talked about planning for what you want to be in the future, but also want to be planning for how you want to manage it and how you're going to apply your people, resources, and capacities to make that happen. Some quick lessons. I know some of these are going to be a little redundant, so I'm going to go through a little quicker, is find ways to work together. A lot of it we talk about is through process. Set up stakeholder groups. Find your sector groups. Find those people that have interests and specialties where they can concentrate and work on those things. Actually, you've heard about we got to break down those silos. Just to be contrary, I sometimes say we got to build those silos up. We got to make sure those silos are there so people can concentrate and get things done along those silos. But we better have a way for those silos to be communicating and working with each other. Find ways to work together. Another lesson, don't grab that first shiny thing that you see. This is a relative of mine that is maybe a year old, but boy, he sure thought that was the best thing that he wanted at that time, and he wanted it. But it probably wasn't the right time for him. Take time to constructively and thoroughly look at your solutions and problems. Understand, I mean, that's one of the big things we see a lot of times is understanding what's the real problem. What are we trying to solve here? Sounds easy to say, but actually it's kind of hard sometimes. Is it the problem getting people out of a temporary housing unit, or is the problem trying to find people long-term, sustainable, livable housing? Or is it jobs? Because if they don't have housing, they're not going to get jobs. Or is it economic base? Because if you don't have economic base in your community, you can't attract jobs for people who want to be living. It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? But once you make that decision, once you do something, it's really hard to back up and do it and try to start all over again. Mary brought this up in a conversation earlier, is where and when do you engage with some of the concepts? Daniel just mentioned it about education. When's the right time to educate people on this? Greensburg started talking about building back green in less than a day. Story is that they were taking shelter the night before. I'm sorry, everybody stole my thunder, so I'm going to steal some of their thunder a little bit. Gene, you were actually there, I think, that the very next night. Another tornado was in the area, and there are people taking shelter in the basement of the courthouse. You know, those conversations about rebuilding green actually started less than 24 hours after the disaster. That's phenomenal. I was actually up in another disaster in Iowa, and I was getting calls. I said, Steve, you need to come down here and work the long-term community recovery program. And I was thinking, oh, boy, this is, it's 3 days. There's no way people are ready for that, because on previous disasters, sometimes it would take 2 or 3 months to get to the table. People just weren't ready for it. Turns out I was really wrong in Greensburg. They were already not only ready, they were moving down that path less than 24 hours after the disaster. Celebrate successes. Disaster recovery is a process. It's incremental. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to have those fishing stories. Share them. Share them amongst each other. Share them amongst other communities. Highlight those people in your community that may not be your everyday leaders, but are really, really important to the community in the long term. Scott Brown, you heard a little bit of him this morning, and he talked about other leaders. But Scott's got a lot of stories on some other neat projects that he was actually leading. You might pull him aside. He's not going to be your overt leader that everybody talks about all the time. I don't know how much camera time he got on Greensburg on the Planet Discovery Channel, but I can tell you he was active every day behind the scenes in the community. You have to celebrate those people and acknowledge the work that they're doing. It's really important to understand roles and responsibilities after a disaster. Disaster hits, the person who's leading the charge after a disaster, who usually does it? Fire chief, your emergency management director, somebody like that. They've got to make quick decisions, they've got to save lives, they've got to move the injured, they've got to clear streets, they've got some really tough decisions that need to be very, very quickly. Do you think they're going to engage the public in that? Highly unlikely. They're not going to go out and have a town hall meeting to see which building they're going to pull off the people very first. There is a transition. The decision-making process and the people in that decision-making process sometimes or often change. It's not always the same people, and it's not always the same process. Not everybody makes that transition very well as far as communities go. It takes a different process when you're talking about recovery. Heard a little bit about this earlier. Do and plan at the same time. Well, that doesn't sound right. What's wrong with that? We're planning to rebuild all these houses in this area, but we've got to rebuild them at the same time we're planning to rebuild them? Yeah, you do actually, in some cases. Sometimes you're going to mess up. You're going to have something built in the wrong spot. You've got to fix that problem. Politically and both in terms of the decision making, but also for community awareness, you've got to make some decisions. You move forward. It's not bad. Plan and do at the same time. You've got to solve problems. You got to fix those problems. Look long term. Look short term. I know Jonathan and Steve Hewitt and Vollmeyer Mayor, they made it look easy up here this morning when they were talking, but it's really hard. It's chaotic. There's a lot of things to balance. Here are some of the other lessons learned, type of processes that were, or mechanisms that were used to bring people to the table. Greensburg and Joplin actually used all of these and more. It took all of those things to make things happen. Public involvement, we've heard a lot about that. You can build leaders through your public involvement too. Some folks that were important to your community or now may not have been active leaders beforehand, or might have been a little bit, behind the scenes. This builds leadership long-term for your community. We've covered this already, covered that, and all my other thunder is stolen, so I'm going to wrap it all up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. In interest of saving time, I'll quickly run through my presentation because I want to show you a video of what we actually do. I work on a project called TIDES. TIDES stands for, and yes, we do have a lot of acronyms in the DoD, but I'll spare you most of them. TIDES stands for Transformative Innovation for Development and Emergency Support. We are a Title X DoD federally funded organization based at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. that provides sustainable support to populations in distress. We are a knowledge-sharing organization about potential solutions for development and emergency support. We seek to support decision makers and those working in the field. TIDES has three main goals. We try to leverage global talent, we try to promote integrated approaches, and we try to sustain through the private sector. TIDES, as a federally funded organization, has a mandate to maintain a network, which we call STAR TIDES. STAR stands for Sharing to Accelerate Research, which is a public-private, whole-of-government, and transnational network of about 1,500 different nodes, military, non-military organizations, private, nonprofit, for-profit organizations, domestic or international, all of which work in the general area which we call FHADR, DSCA, Foreign Humanitarian Assistance, Disaster Relief, and, in the case of U.S. territory, defense support to civil authorities. We try to promote our integrated solutions across 8 infrastructure areas. TIDES works with shelter, power, water, communication, sanitation, heating, cooling, and other technologies. Everything that you need to stand up right away following a disaster, domestic or international. We work on 3 main concentrations. The first one is research analysis and publication and sharing of information about these technologies. I have with me one such sample. My center just concluded a paper called Public-Private Cooperation in DoD. What are the pitfalls and opportunities for the DoD to cooperate with the private sector in disasters and emergencies? We have annual technology demonstrations at National Defense University and at the Pentagon Courtyard, where we actually invite vendors, just like you have here next door, to display your technologies the way they're supposed to work in the field, off the grid, not inside the building, but in the open field, so that our solar companies generate power, our water purification companies purify water, and so on and so forth. We even use solar cookers to cook food. And we run quarterly field experimentations at Camp Roberts National Guard Base in California, where we bring together military, non-military, private sector, and NGOs for field testing of these technologies and for policy discussions of how can we best cooperate following disasters, following emergencies, domestic or international. This is the video from last year's technology demo at National Defense University.
This is our 4th year in a row participating in STAR TIDES.
This is my 5th year at the TIDES demo.
I've been coming to these demonstrations since they began about 5 years ago.
It's an experiment, it's a demonstration of our capabilities. It causes us to stretch a bit. It causes us to try some things that maybe it's difficult to do back at home, back at the factory. We got here in a real field environment. We have real customers who want our power.
I touch people that I might not otherwise see in the course of any other event.
It is a chance for us to bring together folks that never would talk to each other, from the vendor space, from the humanitarian space, from the military space.
People now realize that we actually support 4 legitimate Defense Department missions. One is post-war stabilization and reconstruction, as in Afghanistan. One is humanitarian assistance, disaster relief around the world, where defense often plays a role. One is building capacity of partner nations, which is part of our security development. And the other is defense support of civil authorities domestically here in the United States. We've tried to make this public-private, whole-of-government, transnational. And TIDES is a small staff. We only have a few people actually working it. But the beauty of it is the leveraging.
We have exposed literally thousands of military people over the 5 years to this technology. Not just American military, but also foreign militaries come to the university, and we've been able to expose them.
It's a shelter problem, hunger, thirst, a supply chain problem, illness, injury is a safety, security, public health problem. So that's kind of what led us to the infrastructures we have here.
So we look at shelter, water, power. We look at integrated combustion and solar cooking, heating and cooling, lighting, sanitation, and lots of information and communications technologies.
I've set up probably about 15 to 20 internet sites at hospitals and clinics in Afghanistan. We're working on a project where we've distributed several thousand cell phones where local farmers are SMSing in information about their fields and farms, and then we put that on the map and make it available to the decision makers, and both locally at the village level and up in other levels.
The idea is to get Afghans to communicate to us and communicate in between them and kind of get them involved with technology, text messaging, using the internet.
StarTides really has been focusing in on the gap of immediate post-disaster, immediate post-conflict.
We had 2 volunteers from the U.S. who were called 10 minutes after the Haiti earthquake. A very stripped-down version of a 2-room apartment, but this tent has been specifically designed for very hot weather climates. You can see the semicircles at the bottom. Those vents can be opened. They were in Haiti on the 14th. Took a little while longer to get boxes into Haiti because everybody else, their
How many boxes did you get into Haiti?
We got 28,000 boxes, including a total of 35,000 tents into Haiti. I'm told that was about a third of all the tents that got there.
Wow.
What we do is we manufacture a range of solutions that are essentially solar-powered generators with integrated water purification capability. The system we have back here is actually probably going to be called our Rapid Advanced Max Pure. It can run entirely off solar. It can provide you with 100 gallons of purified water every day from virtually any kind of water source. You can extend your hours of water purification, and then also continue to have readily available power.
Our primary focus right now, and our primary accomplishment, if you like, is this hybrid system that connects the renewables, as you see here, with a conventional generator. We set up our equipment, we started making solar power, and one by one we went to our neighbors and said, what are you powering with that generator? And they said, well, tell us what equipment. And we said, well, how about you turn off the generator and plug into our equipment instead? And so they were all happy to do that. So I think we turned off 3 or 4 generators. Every year we've turned off more generators. Every year we've been able to do more and more with solar power, and I'm happy to see also that we've been joined by other companies doing the same thing to show that there are lots of different approaches.
My parabolic solar cooker from 9 o'clock in the morning has provided everybody with hot water for coffee and tea. And I'm very pleased that people come over here and are seeing that a parabolic cooker can do that. The advantage for me is to be able to expose a lot of people, including senior U.S. and foreign military officials and civilians, to a technology that I think should be spread in the developing world, where fuel is running out, wood fuel is running out, and where there's a lot of pollution from cooking fires. Yesterday and the day before, we cooked hot dogs, beans, we cooked cakes and melted chocolate for strawberries. Today we're cooking food from Pakistan, making banana bread, and of course we continue to boil water so people can have coffee and tea.
What I'd hope is that people who come here with a water purification system could learn from some of the folks who are looking at sanitation, or learn from some of the folks from shelter, say, that's a way I can tie this together. And so that's the main message we've got. How do you integrate?
It's very exciting to meet people who have very good technical solutions.
I think the demonstrations are very effective.
Here in Washington, D.C., we get exposure. We have policymakers who come through and see what's possible.
I've received a lot of queries from provincial reconstruction teams in Iraq and Afghanistan and have provided them with information.
It's always been an interesting experience.
When I think of tides and star tides, I actually think of a catalyst. We're a means of connecting people who have problems with people who may have solutions, and then we try to get out of the way. We're not trying to solve all the problems, we're just trying to make information available that people who need it can use.
This is a small example of what we do as an organization. Lately, we have integrated our work with DHS and FEMA on how to better analyze post-disaster imagery. We brought a lot of federal actors and nonprofit, non-governmental actors to Camp Roberts National Guard Base for policy discussions on how we can all work together to help people who cannot help themselves. I have samples of our manuscript here if you'd like to read it on your own time. And I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to hear so many wonderful stories about how communities help themselves. My job as a federal employee is to make sure your solutions and lessons learned are integrated into the federal response and are socialized up the food chain. Thank you.
What a great and focused mission, and very educational, interesting. Thank you, Samuel. How are we doing on time? 5 to 10 minutes. One of the questions that was posed to me earlier, how, I know the federal government, state government is not in the business of promoting products or services, but in the case of sustainable technologies, how can we get them a leg up, or at least open awareness in these communities that have just had disasters to sustainable options? Any of you?
Is it this? Yeah. Can you hear me all right there? Okay.
I'm going to get you the...
Well, I'll steal an answer. I think I have the lavalier mic, so I think I'm okay. Everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to steal from Greensburg. What was done in Greensburg was they hosted actually 2 or 3 resource fairs for the community. And through the help of a lot of leaders within the community, they brought folks to the table, both in terms of state and federal agencies, but mostly it was private sector folks. They were those individual businesses, not dissimilar than what we saw in next door, but it was in a learning environment, an educational environment where you could sit down with architects with this particular expertise. You could sit down with the businesses that had these products and knew these products, and have one-on-one time with those folks and really learn it, and learn it in a way that was really important for that particular individual or family. I found that was really important to the community and really helped gather a lot of momentum for this particular movement in the community.
So then one that would want to organize such a resource fair would do that through FEMA, or go right to the city that's affected by it, or?
It would depend on what is being engaged, what resources are at the table for that particular community. If it is a declared disaster and FEMA has presence in that community, that gives us the ability to bring certain resources to the table and do certain things. If it is a community that does not have a presidential declaration, we have limitations on how we can come to the table. So it will you would have to depend on that particular community. If it is a presidentially declared disaster, it would make sense to engage with FEMA so that you have an understanding of how the resources are working together. We mentioned that National Disaster Recovery Framework. If we're applying that framework in that particular disaster, it would make sense to actually connect with that framework and those input points within that framework, whether it be through the local government feeding into it or actually through FEMA. So there'd be several different methodologies for how to engage.
We also have a website called OpenEI, which stands for Open Source Energy Information. And similar to what Daniel said, we can't endorse products. So it's not that they're endorsed by NREL, but it is a source of information on energy products that's available out there. Because it's open source, it means anyone can add their information to it on their products. So it kind of becomes a clearinghouse for information on different products if you're interested.
We also have a similar website, startides.net. It flashed in the last few seconds of the video. Open source, unclassified website. Anyone can join, anyone can visit. We maintain a large infrastructure directory of power, shelter, water, communication, sanitation technologies. We invite vendors to list their products there. We don't support or endorse them, but if people have a request for information, we direct them to our website so that they can choose exactly what they need themselves.
Excellent. And that's part of this, what we're just getting going here, that we're calling the Sustainable Disaster Recovery Network. It's all about supporting one another, of those of us who have sustainable products and services and want to collectively get them into areas that have suffered disasters. Another question, I think, just in terms of how does one enlist the support of these different agencies? For example, if somebody wants an aggressive energy savings program, how do they get the participation of NREL?
Well, NREL, we're a phone call away, in that you can give us a call and we can offer initial assistance in terms of ideas and websites, sources you can go to, all of our resources that are available online in terms of our success stories, our lessons learned, best practices, planning guides, all of those things. In terms of having direct assistance in the community, that would need to come from some source. So whether it's coming from funding from the Department of Energy, or coming from the community funding, or from another partner's funding, there does need to be some source if there's going to be on-site assistance for a long-term plan. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want anyone else?
I can jump in here. I'm going to answer the question with a question a little bit as an example. Test question, we've heard about buyouts after floods. How many properties has FEMA bought in its history through these buyout programs? 1,000, 10,000, a million? Anybody want to venture a guess? The answer is 0. FEMA doesn't buy the property. We work through the states who provide resources to local governments, and they buy the properties. The reason I brought this example was that your state is actually a really good place to start with trying to engage with disasters, because most federal agencies work through the states as far as applying their programs. And then another local resource, and we have some folks actually in the room that you can start learning about these, and I think they're actually on a presentation sometime during this event, is the long-term recovery committees, and that provides a connection to a lot of the resources, volunteer resources that are actually taking place in that particular community.
Sam, anything to add? No? So Sam, if somebody wants to engage Tides, how do they go about doing that?
All you have to do is just visit our website. Our information is listed on it. Shoot us a question. We are on social media. We're very active actually on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. You can connect with us that way. And if it's something we cannot do or we cannot solve, we'll pass your question to those who will be most likely to help you. And sometimes that loops back to DHS and FEMA or to other agencies that help populations in distress.
Excellent. Anybody else on the panel have anything they want to add before we wrap up? Thank you all very much. Let's give folks a round of applause.